Okay, good morning, good afternoon on this very rainy, dreary spring day where we're all dreaming about our vegetables and gardening in containers outside, anything outside warm. So welcome to VCE Loudoun's Master Gardener online classroom. My name is Barbara Bailey. I am the Community Engagement Coordinator in charge of the Master Gardeners. Today's class obviously is on vegetable gardening in containers with Denise Palmer. This is Denise's 5th in the Master Gardener online series. So let's get to some of the meeting pleasantries. At the bottom of your screen, you should see a chat box. So if you have a question, please click on the chat box, ask the question, and Denise will answer them at the end of the meeting, end of the session. So as you all may or may not know, Denise Palmer is a Master Gardener from the class of 2005. She is our expert in anything vegetables, and that's really the summary of Denise Palmer. We're very happy to have her for this 5th program, and I will now introduce Denise Palmer. It's all yours, Denise.
Thank you, Barb. Well, good afternoon, and like Barb says, pretty rainy, so it's a good time to sit together and learn a little bit about how we're going to plant some vegetables in some containers and actually grow them so that they'll grow well. I do want to, before I go any further, one thing I do want to say is even if you're an in-ground gardener, we want to be watching the weather. For those of you who don't have weather stations on your desk or aren't that much into the weather, please be prepared that the nighttime lows are forecast to go into the 30s and 40s over the next few days. So I know we always say Mother's Day is that day to plant out your vegetables, the summer vegetables, but we're going to want to be careful about that this year because those lows are really too low for us to be putting out our summer vegetables into our vegetable garden. So just be fair warned, if you already have them in, you may need to consider getting something to protect them in the overnight when it does go into the 30s and 40s, and then taking those off during the day so that the plants don't burn up. Having said that, let's go ahead and get started on our series today, which is vegetable gardening in containers. Yep, and of course I'm gonna have to go back out and come back in because I think it has frozen. It has. Oh, there we go. There we go. I got it to work. You just have to hit your mouse button a few times. So vegetable gardening in containers, and I don't think it's probably a stretch for anyone here that is listening to me as to why you're probably gardening in containers. Now, a long time ago, when I first moved here to Virginia with a small yard and how am I going to grow vegetables in this small yard, vegetable gardening in containers was kind of a niche thing. You had to find somebody that knew how to do it. Our choices and selections in container materials, along with the types of soils that we needed to use, along with varieties of vegetables which would fit into the containers and grow well, was very, very sparse. But in the last, I would say 5 or 6 years, vegetable gardening containers has really just kind of exploded. And especially here in Loudoun County, we find a lot of people who do vegetables in containers, either because they don't have a yard or they maybe don't have the time that would take for an in-ground garden or a raised bed garden, or maybe they're just new at it and want to find out a few things before they go all in. So containers, great if you have no yard. Maybe you live in a condo where you have a sunny balcony. Maybe you have a yard, but it's just unusable as far as growing in-ground vegetables. And of course, I have a small yard and I do have some raised beds, but I use my containers to supplement my raised beds. And I'm doing that more and more as the trees have matured around my yard. I'm using the containers and I'm kind of moving them around so that I can get suitable sun. So the advantages are many. Obviously it would be simpler and easier to manage something in a container than if you're out in-ground gardening. Tending and harvesting, it's going to require far less time. Of course, weeds, we don't get weeds in those containers very often. And if we do, it's usually because we got birds poking around in our containers, and they're depositing the weeds into our containers. I think a really good foundation about containers is with diseases. We're most of the time using new potting soil every year. So we don't have to worry about soil, which is maybe had some disease, got some disease characteristics over the years as in an in-ground garden. And so we don't have to worry about that aspect of our vegetables because most times we're using new potting soil each year. And for those who always find themselves in the situation where they're overcommitting, containers, it's pretty hard to overcommit because you've got your container and that's what you're going to plant, and that's what we're going to manage over the long term. However, for those of you who may be new, we have some advice. Please start small. Containers are much easier to manage, but if you've gone out and bought 20 containers, let's say in the spring, because of the circumstances we find ourselves in, understand that each of those containers is going to have to be watered, fertilized at some point, and it's going to have to be maintained. So if you haven't bought your containers yet, or you're considering, and you're a new gardener, please start small. Take about half of what you're thinking, and that's what you really want to focus on. And then grow stuff that you like to eat. It's very artistic to grow, different colors and styles and varieties and textures of plants. But if you're not going to really eat them, then, you may find yourself growing weary of actually maintaining them. Choose things which taste best when they're just picked. And I've got those listed out there. Now, it says peas in there. But we're a little late in the season to be planting peas unless your peas will be growing in a relatively shady and cool area. Peas have a tendency to burn up when we start to get into the heat of the summer. I like to plant my herbs. Herbs in containers is just a space-saving way to grow herbs. Plus, they're probably close by, like on a deck or a patio or maybe a front porch. So you can run out there and clip a few, bring them into the kitchen and use them within your meal planning. If they're out in my back of my yard where my raised beds are, I have this tendency to say, well, next time, I'll get them next time. I love to grow herbs in containers. I think that it's a really great way to get started because herbs, they can be more forgiving than some of our summer vegetables. And also they can be very expensive in the store. So herbs in containers can also save you some money. And then try varieties in your containers that they don't sell at the grocery store. Most of the types of vegetables that you find in the grocery store aren't really being sold to you because they taste well. They're being sold to you because at processing, they can process a whole bunch at one time. They ship well, they store well. And so while you may like the tomato or have the tomato at the grocery store and be able to buy it, sometimes they can taste a little bit cardboardy, shall I say. So growing your own vegetables in containers is a good way to try different varieties that you wouldn't get out of a grocery store. So here's where we come to location, and this location isn't going to be any different than probably an in-ground or a raised bed garden. We want to choose locations which are close to the house because we want to be able to monitor our garden during the summertime, see if it needs watering, see if we need to maintain it, maybe do some trellising as things start to grow out. And then don't forget that you do have sun requirements for your vegetables. So summer vegetables really need to have 8 hours of sunlight in order to do well. Now, having said that, if you've got a patio that gets brilliant sun all day long and you've got smaller containers, beware that those containers are going to dry out really quickly. So we want to be careful and choosing a location, if we have choices, choosing a location that may have some brief respite from an afternoon sun, so that we're not finding ourselves with our vegetables burning up in our containers. 6 hours of sunlight for leafy greens, carrots, and radishes. And, greens, lettuces, Swiss chard, those kinds of things, they look very pretty in containers. And they can grow well in a container during the summertime, as long as they can have some shade during the summer. Radishes really is a spring vegetable, and they really get too woody tasting during the summer. So we'll just keep our radishes and we'll harvest them in May and early June, and then we'll be done with our radish. Containers are going to need probably more water than your raised bed or an in-ground. So make sure you have a source of water, and make sure it's the right way to utilize the water, whether that be a watering can or you have some kind of showering system off of your hose. Because remember, the containers, we've just got this container sitting there, and if we start, blasting water at it like it's on like a pressure sprayer, guess what? We're going to disturb all the roots in that container, and we're going to have dirt blasting out and overfilling. So we also want to consider carefully how we're going to water these containers, and water them so that we're not blasting our vegetable that's in the container, because we're probably going to have some issues if that starts to happen. Also, everything starts out really small, and we put it in our container and we say, this will be perfect for my container because this plant is only 4 inches tall. Well, guess what happens to a tomato in about 6 weeks? If it's growing, it's going to grow really well in that container. And so what is around us, are we just shoving it into a corner where in 6 weeks we're going to need to pull it out to give it some space to sort of, breathe and spread. And we also want to be careful that we're not spacing our containers too close together when it comes to vegetables. Ornamentals, they can be a little bit closer together, but with our vegetables, we really want some space between them, because we want air circulating around them so that we don't have disease issues upon our, especially tomatoes and peppers. They can be subject to disease issues when when the leaves stay too wet, when they're too close together and don't have air circulation, or when they're being overwatered. If you are placing it on like a deck or a patio or some other thing, consider whether after you've got the container, it's been sitting there for a couple of months, whether you're going to mark up the surface underneath it. So a lot of the containers, we've got soil in, some of that, so you always have drainage holes in your container. If you've got a brand new patio and your significant other is not going to be very happy about the fact that you've marked up the new patio. We'll also want to consider what we can put underneath the container to protect our surface underneath. That also goes for if you're, say, living in an apartment or a condo and you've got a wooden deck and you're watering your containers, and let's say you're on the 2nd or 3rd floor, what can you put underneath so that water isn't constantly dripping down on the neighbor below? And then consider also with containers, problems you may have. Do you have children? And do your children like to pick off vegetables, which is a great thing. Don't get me wrong, that's a wonderful thing. But if you're growing hot peppers and you got kids and they're taste testing, you want to be aware where you're placing your containers, and maybe place it out of their reach so they can't get a hold of it. As well, if you're placing it on a deck or a patio, and you've got wildlife coming through your yard, beware. They will come up onto your deck or your patio in order to get what it is you have there. I have my own experience is that the squirrels, once they see there's something happening up on my deck, they're up there checking it out every day to see what I have growing up there. And if they don't like what I have growing up there, what they're doing is they're digging holes in the container to hide their sunflower seeds. So I get a little bit aggravated about that, but I found some chicken wire over the soil in a container will help keep those wily squirrels from digging up all of my plants. So let's talk about the kind of summer vegetables, and this list is not inclusive. There are other things that you could probably grow. These just seem to be some of the most popular things that people like to put in containers, and some things that I commonly get asked about as far as growing in a container. Once again, beware that containers can get very hot on a deck or patio, and we want to be careful about burning up our containers. And I'll probably say that a couple more times before this series is ended today. So, but really look at your containers. Now that we have all the trees, the leaves on the trees, two things. I've noticed how unsunny some areas are now in my own particular yard, and I've noticed how warm those couple of days where we had mid 70s or late 70s. I noticed how warm some of the areas, especially on my front porch, are getting with the increasing sunlight. So really take a look at that before you place your containers. Seed packets will always list your maturity dates, how long it's going to take to get from planting in that container to the time that you can expect to have a mature fruit. So if you're not certain how long it is, seed packets, now understand some of our summer vegetables are going in as transplants. Hopefully you have your transplants, because I've been at the garden stores recently and I'm finding that the selection is getting thinner and thinner and thinner. Although I haven't been every place, but I have seen some some stores, some nurseries and home improvement stores which have basically nothing in stock anymore. So those things which have to go in transplants, you may have to search to find a transplant that you can plant in your container. Now, beans are a popular thing to plant in a container, but understand a bush bean, if you're planting it out in a container, you're probably only going to get a couple plants unless it's a very big container. Pole beans can be planted in a container, but they're going to require extensive trellising. What I have seen people do is to plant a pole bean in a container, and then they already have a trellis or lattice work on their deck where they allow the bean to grow up. So that's probably the best use of a pole bean in a container, is you already have something available on your deck or your patio for these beans to grow up. Cucumbers, we want to look for compact types. Once again, the explosion of varieties which are suitable for containers is overwhelming. And so if you're looking at a seed rack and you're looking at these vegetable types and you're growing in containers, you are looking for information which tells you that these types of vegetables are bush or compact or dwarf or some variety like that. So cucumbers, compact types, are well suited to container. I would say that you should allow some space around your container so it can sort of sprawl over the container. Cucumbers will grow readily up a trellis. So if you can install a trellis in your container, a small little trellis, cucumbers will grow up that fairly successfully. Melons, stay with the small ones. I don't think I have to explain that too far, because, obviously anything that's larger than probably softball is going to get out of control fairly quickly. So, if you're interested in melons, make sure that you are reading the seed packet for how big the fruit can get. Pumpkins can go in there. Now, pumpkins, they have some very good varieties. They're small, very small pumpkins. I forget some of the varieties at the moment, but there's a fairly large number where there's smaller varieties, and they're great for kids. Kids love pumpkins, but do give pumpkins some sprawling space, because pumpkins don't typically come in compact or dwarf. the vines will spill out over the container, and they will need area to sprawl around the container. Now, squash, summer squash types, you want to stick with the bush types. So once again, we're sticking with a type that's not a viner. Bush types can go successfully in a container. I've grown zucchini type summer squashes in containers fairly successfully. We get to the tomatoes. Now tomatoes, and we'll get to volume and how big your containers are a little later, but we want to really watch our tomatoes. Again, we're looking for the key words: bush, compact, patios, or dwarf. If we're talking about a regular size container, and regular size will be defined later on in this PowerPoint. If we're looking at, oh, I want to grow an heirloom tomato, or I want to grow a cherry tomato, once again, if you have something that this tomato can sprawl on, it can vine up, such as a lattice work or other thing already installed, that would be perfect. Otherwise, understand that for an heirloom type tomato, or a vining tomato, or an indeterminate tomato, cherry tomato, all of those are going to require a fairly large container to contain the root ball, and large staking in order to keep it so it doesn't tip over, doesn't blow to the ends of the earth when we get the thunderstorms. So for new gardeners, I would just really suggest sticking with bush or compact or patio type tomatoes, just to get a feel for what it is, how they grow, and how big they are. Even bush and compact tomatoes are still going to need some kind of staking. You can't just plant them and then let them go. It'll be good for about 30 days, and then after 30 days, you're going to learn a little lesson. You're going to learn that they're going to tip over, or the stems may break off, or what have you. So you will, even with the smaller tomato varieties, you still will need some kind of caging or trellising. Peppers obviously grow very well in containers because they are a smaller plant. Now, peppers, again, will go in as transplants, as tomatoes. Tomatoes will go in as transplants as well. One thing to keep in mind with peppers are extremely brittle. They have very brittle stems. And so at first, you know, they're okay, they're doing great, they're growing like nobody's mama. And then you start to see maybe some stems start to break off once we get 45 days into their growing period. And that's usually when they start to get fruit on the vine. And when they do that, the fruit gets bigger and it may snap off stems of the peppers. So I always say, make sure you get your peppers staked well in your container right when you put them into the container. Eggplant, I love eggplant in containers, and the reason why I do is because in order to minimize flea beetle damage, we want to usually get our eggplant about 3 foot off the ground. And that's so the immature flea beetles don't drive our eggplant crazy. Plant grower, you already know flea beetles are your worst enemy. So I like to get my eggplants about 3 foot off the ground, and I do that by putting them in a container and putting them up on some bricks so that I get them off the ground. Once again, eggplants will go in as transplants, and once again, eggplants get fairly large. So you're going to want to make sure that they are well staked into that container with caging or trellising. And then sweet potatoes. Sweet potatoes, usually you put them in a slips. You always put them in a slips, not usually. And you usually get the slips from a seed purveyor online, or maybe a friend's got some extra, what have you. You can grow sweet potatoes fairly successfully in containers. And its benefit is if you have a vole problem, and voles like to eat everything under the ground and chew on things, it protects. If you're growing your sweet potatoes in a container, it protects them if you have vole issues. Now, depending on how many sweet potatoes you intend to grow, you may need a fairly large container or several large containers. But sweet potato vines are very, very decorative. You can let the vines sprawl to the ends of the earth. I've seen some really great ways to grow sweet potatoes in containers. So if you're interested in sweet potatoes, I would recommend doing some Googling of some images online to see the different ways you can do. And as I said, they're very decorative as well. You can use them to really dress up front porch or a front yard. So I've already talked a little bit about seed and plant selection for your containers. When we're buying the seeds, because we're planting in containers, oftentimes we're not using maybe but 1, 2, 3, or 4, 5 seeds. So just beware that you can save your seeds, and they're generally good for 3 to 5 years if you're keeping them in a cool and dark location. You know, if they're just laying out in the sun or they're in the hot or they get wet, your seed viability for the next year is probably not going to be very good. So once you finish using them, do what I do, just put them in a plastic container and put that container, I usually just put it in my basement and let it sit until the next year. On a seed packet, it's going to tell you, most of the time, it's going to tell you the information you need to know. Seed packets are having a tendency to use less and less information. I think that's because we have the smartphones and we can Google the variety online and find out more information about what's in the seed packet. But generally, they're going to have your description. They're going to tell you whether it's appropriate for container. It's going to use the keywords, compact, bush, dwarf, suited for containers. I've even seen that. It's going to have your days to maturity, the planting requirements. By planting requirements, I mean how deep in the soil a seed should be planted, generally when it should be planted, if it should be planted after frost, and the date it was packaged. When you're looking at your seeds and you're trying to make a decision, seed packets which have been considered all-American selections or AAS selections if it says that on the seed packet, it's a selection that has wide suitability for all areas in the United States, and it has done very well. So you can never go wrong picking a variety which was an AAS winner. When you're buying your transplants, as your tomatoes and peppers and eggplants will be, we're always looking for short and compact plants rather than tall and lanky or leggy. Usually you see leggy when it comes to our tomato plants. We want them to be dark green rather than pale green or yellow. But I'll be quite honest with you, if you haven't bought your plants already, you're probably looking at needing to get some of the pale green or yellow plants because so much has been bought out already. But you know, you're looking at your plants. You don't want to see disease on your leaves, circles or rings, and we don't want to see yellow leaves on our transplants. We would choose something else than that particular plant. I know as master gardeners always consider ourselves that we can usually save a plant. And so we have this tendency or this innate tendency to want to pick the sickest one and then take it home and see nurse it back to health. But that's really a bad idea because we don't know what kind of disease it could have, it could harbor, and we could be bringing that disease home to whatever other plants we have in our house. So try to choose the ones that look healthy. And then if we're left to only buying the ones that look unhealthy, just beware. You may have to watch it carefully, and if it doesn't sort of come out of it, then you may need to get rid of it. Always check for insects and disease. Insects, if you look on the top of the leaf and at the bottom side of the leaf, make sure we don't have any creepy crawlers on that when we're choosing our transplants. And this is the last one here is something that, people, they just have a hard time doing because, they're going to the plant that already has the fruit, even though the plant may only be 12 inches tall. So, oh my goodness, it's already started a pepper. It's already started a little tomato. But remember, your tomato is probably only 12 or 18 inches tall. And we really don't want it going to fruit yet, because if the plant is saying fruit, that plant's not going to grow up. So we want to avoid plants, or we want to take off the blossoms or the fruit on little plants that have that, simply because when we get it planted in our container, we don't want it trying to fruit right away. We want it to grow up, and we want it to grow big and strong before we want it to start fruiting. Another thing you can always do is search online for appropriate varieties which are well suited to container gardens. And I say that because each year new varieties come out for containers. And so, whatever the latest thing is, I may not necessarily know about it. You may not necessarily know about it. But if you Google container vegetables, some new varieties that have new characteristics, maybe something you're interested in, and you can get a hold of online. So let's look at types of materials for containers. It's probably what I get asked the most questions about, is what can I grow these vegetables in? So the plastic containers, the light colored containers, they're the least expensive ones. We have a tendency to gravitate toward them because they are least expensive in cost. And, maybe we're not sure we want to go all in. And so plastic is going to be more, we'll be spending less on it. So we won't have the expense involved if we're just sort of testing the waters. The good thing about plastic is it's lightweight, it warms and cools quickly, it doesn't take moisture away from your plant roots. And it may be appropriate for balconies or other places where, you put it out and then you got to take it back in and you've got to store it at the end of the season. So plastic certainly has its place. And there are many different kinds and colors now in all kinds of sizes. The plastic, the black colored ones, and those would be like nursery pots. So we like to recycle. And so many people like to take the nursery pots that they may have got planting something else in the yard, and they like to reuse it. And it's perfectly acceptable to reuse after we disinfect the pots. We want to make sure that whatever was in it before is not going to spread to whatever it is we're going to grow now. So if you're reusing nursery pots, please make sure that you are disinfecting those before you're using those for your vegetables. I will say though, if your black can heat up very quickly, and so during the heat of the summer, say in July and August, if the pot isn't big enough and it doesn't have enough mass, it may actually burn your vegetable roots. So we want to carefully consider what we're growing, where it's going to be located, how hot it may get during the summer, and make a decision whether or not that this pot, this black colored pot, may actually heat up too much for what it is we're trying to do. Terracotta, ceramic, and concrete, lots of different selection and size in those right now. The only thing is if you get one big enough, you can't move it around. And so, if we buy a beautiful decorative one, maybe we're going to grow some vegetables on our front porch. Just keep in mind that once you put potting soil in and once you got your vegetables in, and if you need to move it for any reason, you may not be able to move it for any reason. So keep that in mind if you're buying those. They retain heat for long periods of time, and anything that's retaining heat means that it's drawing moisture away from your plant roots. So we want to make sure our container is large enough for whatever it is we're growing in it, so that there's plenty of moisture for the pot and there's plenty of moisture for the vegetable, and that we're monitoring these during hot periods at least twice daily. So we're going out to look in the morning, going out to look in the evening. Do these things need to be watered? And during the heat of the summer, they may need to be watered twice a day. And then if you leave them, if you don't have any place to store these during the off season, just keep in mind that generally they will crack if they're left in freezing temps with soil. So you may need to consider ways to store them. Fabric grow bags. So I like fabric grow bags, and I grow things in fabric grow bags. And I like them just because they're so easy to work with. They fold up when it's off season. I don't need to have huge storage capabilities in order to store them. So a fabric grow bag, and you can Google it online after this if you're not familiar. Actually, I think I have a picture after this. The roots stay cooler, and that's because the roots are self-pruning. So your plant grows in this container. It's fabric around it. You've got potting soil. You've got you're watering. You're doing all these different things. But we're getting air and gas exchange through the fabric between the roots and the air around it. And so it's what's called air pruning. The roots will stop when they get to the fabric, and they won't continue to go in circles. So some of you are probably familiar with girdling roots. So when we're using a fabric grow bag, it's not girdling the roots, going in a circle like it would in a plastic container. Instead, the roots are growing out, they're growing to the fabric, and they're stopping. And then what will happen is the plant will put out another root, it grows to the fabric, it stops, and so on and so forth. So usually in a fabric grow bag, we're not having the problem of girdling roots. Now, fabric grow bags are fabric. So during hot summer days, we're going to have some water loss simply because we do have more air and gas exchange between the fabric. So if we got too small in the fabric grow bags, smaller sizes may require watering twice a day in the hot summer sun. I like to get the trays. Some of them come with their own trays if you're purchasing them online, and you can actually set them in trays where it will hold some water so that the water will be taken up during the daytime heat. And then once again, I love it for storage. You can store these things flat. Don't have to have a lot of storage. Now, fiberglass is also another popular item these days because they come in so many different colors. They can be very decorative, and they're designed to mimic heavier materials. A lot of times they look like they are terracotta or ceramic. I like them. They're durable. They're lightweight. I would consider them, along the same lines as plastic. If we're using wood like wine barrels or whiskey barrels or whatever kind of barrels we're using, it's perfectly fine. And it's actually half wine barrel is actually a great container to grow tomato in, because it has the kind of space that you'll need if you're growing like a cherry or an heirloom tomato. It also has the kind of heft you'll need to keep that tomato anchored down instead of being blown over. And then some people have access to metal tubs, galvanized tubs. Galvanized metal, if you're growing vegetables in a galvanized metal tub, doesn't pose a risk for vegetables. But you do have to keep in mind that metal on a hot summer day gets very hot. So once again, if we're talking just about a little metal pot that we're growing something in, understand that metal is going to heat up fairly extensively. If we're talking about a galvanized metal tub, like a cattle water or something to that effect, it's got a little more mass to it. So we may not have the problems with heat that we would have with a smaller metal container. And then I've got some pictures you can see. Well, it's my left in the upper left, the fabric grow bags. They come in all kinds of sizes and shapes. And price points too. Online, they've become, a lot of people have fairly interested in growing them because they are so easy to store and they are easy to use. The raised wooden boxes, I have my left center, the raised wooden boxes. I actually use one of these, and this is where I grow my peppers in. I actually have my peppers growing in one. It's a little larger than that, but I grow my peppers up off the ground just because I can set this as my sun disappears in certain areas in my yard. I can move this each year so where my peppers can get the appropriate amount of sun. We're going to talk about self-watering containers. Self-watering containers, I am a big proponent of self-watering containers. I love them, and I think that if you're really into the container vegetable thing, self-watering containers is where it's at. Galvanized metal tubs, black nursery pots, and here's on this picture my right center, where they've actually dug the pot somewhat into the ground to help mitigate some of the sun exposure and the heat. And in the middle, the earth box, and I put the earth box in there because when I first started container gardening, other than just sort of doing it myself, this was sort of the first commercial self-watering container you could get your hands on. And so I tested these out, and I actually like them. I like them a lot. You can grow, you can see I've got a tomato in there right now, but you can grow big plants in these things, and the boxes aren't overly big. It is a self-watering feature, and then you can trellis them up as your plant grows, and you can get fairly good production out of them. So let's talk about the self-watering container. Self-watering is, as it says, it's self-watering. So what does that mean exactly? It means that usually with a container that's considered a self-water, what you have is you have some kind of hole or spout or spigot where you're putting the water into. So in the picture here, you can see at the top where it's got a little round thing at the top of the container itself, and that's where you're putting the water into. Or you could actually be putting the water into the bottom. It just depends upon your container. But what you're doing is you're filling up this little reservoir at the bottom of the container. And then what happens is water will move up as the plant needs it. As the soil dries out, the water is going to move up to the root structure. So I was talking about the earth box on the previous slide. So and it's been my experience with an earth box that if I'm growing, let's say a large tomato in an earth box, I can go 3 days before I have to fill that thing up with a large tomato. Now, if it's very hot, let's say it's over 95 degrees, then I'm probably going to have to fill it up every 2 days. But, it saves me time, and I've learned how often I need to go out and check for watering. But in an earth box like that, I can usually go 3 days before I have to fill up the reservoir at the bottom. And that's why I like them. Water's available, so if it does get hot, the water's there, the plant can take it up, and I don't have to be checking on this plant once or twice a day when it's hot. Now they do make smaller self-watering containers, and once again, the reservoir is going to be smaller, but during the hot summer, you may not have to look at your plant twice a day. You may only have to check it once a day and make sure that reservoir is full. And a good thing about filling from the bottom is because we never want to water our plant from the top. And that is to say, we don't want to get our leaves wet. So when we're watering our plant, it's very nice. We take our little shower spray and we just kind of zen out and we just water sort of the leaves, because a lot of us think, oh my goodness, I'm watering the leaves. This plant is just loving it. It's just sucking up those waters to the leaves. In actuality, what the plant is saying, get the water off my leaves because I'm going to get diseased. You're going to disease me. So what we don't want to be doing is watering our plant leaves. It's very nice, and a lot of people think that the plant is taking up more water through the leaves, but it's just a bad practice. So even if we don't have a self-watering container, we always want to make sure when we're watering our plant that we're watering the soil, not the leaves, or we're putting it in a reservoir for self-watering. So from a disease standpoint, self-watering container is just, it's spot on, because you are never going to get close to that plant with water. Instead, you're filling up that reservoir and you're letting the plant dictate when and how much water it wants. So when we talk container sizes, you know, we say, oh my goodness. And this is where, you know, when you're on a Zoom broadcast, you're kind of like, oh, I wish I could do this in person, because I had all my containers that I would show so that you could in actuality see how big the containers were. Unfortunately, we're on Zoom, and so I'm going to give you dimensions. And if you have containers, you might want to look at the bottom already, because in most instances, it will tell you how many gallons it is. For inches, if I'm doing description in inches, I mean, you should have a measuring tape where you can just measure it off. But for a container vegetable garden, regardless of what we're growing, we always want containers at least 6 inches, if not 8 inches deep. So that would be deep, not necessarily wide. Make sure any container that we're using that it has drainage holes in the bottom, because if you're just putting water into a pot that doesn't have any drainage, guess what? We're going to get a lot of root rot on that plant. So make sure you have drainage holes in the bottom of your plant or your pot. And then again, consider your self-watering containers. It just takes some of the guesswork out of watering. So our small pots are 4 to 6 inches and up to a 2-gallon. You know, we got our little frilly things like our lettuces and our spinaches and our herbs and our chives. And let me set a moment on the herbs, because I've mentioned herbs before. Now, most herbs come from the Mediterranean, and most herbs like it to be hot and dry, and they don't like wet feet. So if we're growing herbs in our pots, let's just remember not to especially overwater them. Most herbs, you know, too much water will usually lead to some leaf rot, some root rot, or the plant itself just won't do very well. Our medium-sized pots, 8 to 12s, 2 to 5 gallons, and we can grow those particular vegetables that I have listed there out. And then our large container is considered to be bigger than 12 inches deep and 5 or more gallons. And we can grow our larger vegetables like our broccolis and cabbages, cucumbers, melons, squash, and a large tomato. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with, what is that guy called? The tomato guy. He's from North Carolina. And it is where I was introduced to growing large tomatoes in 5-gallon buckets. He has, I think he has a website if you want any more information about it. But he really does a great job of explaining how to grow large tomatoes in 5-gallon buckets. Keeping in mind that the 5-gallon bucket does have to have drainage holes in it. But he has quite a display of tomatoes that he grows on his driveway in 5-gallon buckets, and he does it fairly successfully. So you may want to look that up, but 5 or more gallons, when we're thinking 5 or more gallons, we're thinking of 5-gallon buckets, like the home improvement buckets that you would get. So that's really what we're kind of looking at for mass when we're growing our larger vegetables. And then, of course, you can do the hanging baskets for those particular vegetables. I just have to tell you, I'm not a fan of the hanging baskets. I have found over and over that they just dry out way too quickly for me, and I can't seem to get a hold on the watering issues with them. But if you're a good waterer and you got a good watering system set up, go for it. Those are vegetables they'll be fairly stable in growing them in hanging baskets. So soils, when we're filling up our containers, well, we can't just go get a get a shovel and a spade and go out to our garden. We want to use good potting soil mixes. And yes, those will have to be purchased at the home improvement store, or you can Google online on how to make, or actually I think I have my own mix there too. But use a good quality potting soil. And I say good quality because if you open up that potting soil and it smells really bad, that's not a potting soil we really want to use. You know, we got one shot at this. You know, let's use the good stuff if we're really into growing quality vegetables in our containers and in getting production. Don't use garden soil. If the bag stuff at the home improvement store says garden soil, do not use it in containers. Don't use topsoil in containers. It's just too heavy, poor drainage, and it's just going to be a nightmare. As well, don't use soilless mixtures. Soil that you would start your seeds in the season. We don't want to use it. It's simply too light and does not hold enough water. So a good quality potting soil, that's what we want to use. And then we can recycle and reuse potting soils. I do that myself because I grow a lot of tomatoes and peppers, but I can't reuse that year to year because of the risk of disease. So what I do is I take it out at the end of the season. I just put it in a little holding pile for the next year. I'll take it, I'll probably amend it with some compost, half compost, and then I'll reuse it for annuals when I plant out annuals in the new season. But we don't want to reuse potting mixes for the vegetables I have there simply because of the issue with disease transmission. And like I said, you know, we got one shot at this and we want to make it, you know, straight off the starting line as good as we can. And then another question I commonly get, you know, you got these large containers, and do I need to put all potting soil in a large container? Well, it depends. If you've got a large tomato, probably the answer is yes. However, if you've got a large container and we're not growing a large tomato, you may have some space that you don't need to fill up with potting soil. So when we're considering what we can put at the bottom of our container, we need to be very, very careful. There's a lot of misinformation out there about what we can fill the bottom of that container so we don't have to use expensive potting soil in the host space. And we never want to use anything which breaks down or decays, because if it's breaking down and decaying, guess what? It's potentially giving your vegetable in that container disease issues. We don't want to use anything which could transfer disease or pest to our plant roots. And then we don't want to use anything which could leach chemicals to our plant roots. So those are sort of our parameters. You also have to be careful because different substrates can hinder drainage. So we don't necessarily want to throw, you know, this and that in because I happen to have it, because if we're using different substrates, then we could be hindering our drainage and making it so that the water is just sitting. If you have a huge container and you have a big tomato, you'll need to use heavy filler material in the bottom of that pot, simply because of the fact that that plant needs to stay in one place. And if we've only used half potting soil and we filled it up with foam peanuts, guess what? That tomato's going over. And then containers for light plants. Consider compost. Compost is acceptable. Non-biodegradable packing materials like peanuts or crushed milk jugs. Those are some things you could use if you didn't want to fill your container all the way up. And then remember to always use a piece of landscape fabric between your filler material and the potting mix above. And that way it creates that root barrier so that your roots won't penetrate down into your substrate below. And then never fill your container more than up to 1/3 with filler material. So if you have a big wine barrel, only 1/3 of it can be filled at the bottom with filler material. And then we've got something on how to plant a container. And we never want to fill our container up to the top with soil. We always want to make our container so it's about 2 inches from the top with the soil. And that's simply because we need room to plant our plants or sprout our seed. And if we just have it right at the top and we're watering, most likely we're going to wash it off of the container. We always want to make sure that we're watering our potting soil thoroughly after we plant, or maybe even before we plant in the case of transplants. And then we're always following for seeds when we're planting, how deep we plant them, what their spacing is. We want to follow the instructions on our seed plant. Watering, I've talked a little bit about watering. We've talked a lot about there may need more than once a day. We're watering the soil, not the leaves. And then watch when we're watering our containers on cooler days, because that can also be a problem. If we're just arbitrarily watering it every day, watering it every day, watering it every day, and it's cooler, we could be creating a situation where the soil stays wet too long. So, the best way to know if your plant needs to be watered is to stick your finger in the soil about an inch or so down and decide if it needs to be watered. And then fertilization. A lot of these potting soil mixes already come with fertilization in it. So when it comes to fertilizing, we need to be careful. The potting soil mixes, read the label on your potting soil, come with fertilizer already put into the potting soil. If it doesn't, then you're going to need to add additional dry fertilizer to that container or to that mix. If it does, generally the rule is that the container is not going to need to be fertilized for the first 30 days. And then after that, we're probably going to have to supplement. Your plant's really going to tell you whether or not it needs, if it looks kind of sad, if you see the leaves start to yellow out a little bit, if it's just not growing, it may be possible that it needs a fertilizer spike. So you may need to get some dry fertilizer, sprinkle it in the root zone, do not dig it in, and then water it in. Or you can use materials where you dilute it with water, sort of like the Miracle-Gro. I know there's other brands out there as well. That's just an example where you dilute it with water and then you water the soil. So container vegetables will need additional fertilization in most instances, but for the first 30 days, we should be okay. And the reason why this happens is because we're watering containers more and more. And so the fertilizer that's in that soil is getting leached out. So in most instances, they will need additional fertilization. Look at your home improvement stores on the shelves. Make sure you're reading labels as to how much to use and how often to use. And that will tell you, and that will really guide you on how often to fertilize the plant. And then other considerations, I talked about trellises, different kinds of trellises that fit in containers. I've sort of got some pictures there. For our critters, we want to look at, we will get critters too. Never fear, just because you got it in a pot doesn't mean the critters are going to leave it alone. So for containers, they've got some really cool things out there. They got pop-up mesh screens that you can put over your containers. And you can also look at using row cover, which you would use in an in-ground garden or a raised garden. I use row cover in my containers when I see a problem, especially with birds or squirrels. Sometimes I'll throw some row cover over there to dissuade them from getting at whatever it is they're trying to get at. I use a lot of chicken wire too to protect my container soil from the different critters that like to dig in my soil. Insects, they're going to come. Just because you got it in a container doesn't mean your insects are going to come. So you'll need to, be monitoring your plants for pests and then figuring out what kind of pest it is, and then taking the appropriate measures when you've identified the kind of pest, and identify whether it's a good pest or a bad pest, because good pests, we're going to leave them alone. Bad pests, well, we're just going to look at them, maybe pick them off, and then if things overwhelm us, we may want to seek additional help in how we can mitigate the pest issue. And this will conclude my session on container vegetable garden. So Barb, do we have questions?
Yes, ma'am. You did answer a lot of them as you went through, which was fantastic. So we have a question on, do you have any recommendations for seed packet brands?
For seed packet brands?
Yes, ma'am.
Well, normally we don't like to give out or give certain ones because, you know, there's so many different varieties. Um, you know, seed packet purveyors and companies, they all have their unique niches in what they do. And I know there's actually several companies out there that do a fine job of providing container vegetables, especially for the container vegetables. You have to go online. Well, you can look online. They also have them in the stores. You know, it really depends upon your own, you know, if you're an organic gardener and you want organic seeds, then you can Google that. But as far as specific brands, you know, I use many of them. I don't find much problem. You always have problems, but I don't find between brand to brand, I don't find many issues between them. It's more how when you get the seeds and storing them and taking care of them, and then using them.
Okay, great. So there was a question about, you talked about the darker the container, the hotter it gets. So someone had asked a question about, what if you painted the container a lighter color? Would that be the same as paint, you know, buying a light one? And then a follow-up question, if you did that, is there consideration on the paint that you're using?
Yeah, well, I would say, okay, so I'm the kind of person, you know, I'll go buy a can of spray paint thinking that, you know, I can get what I want without needing to buy a new container. And what I found is that the paint flakes off. So there you go.
Exactly.
So I've actually done that and trying to save money, but you know, spray paint's not cheap these days. You would mitigate if you had a darker container. You would mitigate the heat gain because of the dark color by spray painting. But my experience tells me that paint usually flakes off. And you know, if it flakes off at the end of the season, that's no big deal. But then you are using spray paint, and if you have these, you know, if you have these plants sitting in a saucer, you know, are the roots uptaking whatever chemicals are in the spray paint because it's now dissolved at the bottom of your saucer? So those are all considerations. You know, plastic, unless it's a huge container, and I can see the expense involved. If you have a huge container, it's a darker container. You know, wood would be easier to manage than, let's say, plastic. You know, just overall, plastic is cheap enough that I just go buy a new one because the spray paint's going to be more expensive. Metal, it's very hard to paint metal. It usually doesn't stay either. So it really depends on, you know, what you're using, how you're using it, and how resilient you are. But yeah, those are considerations. You know, yes, especially to your last one,
Right.
and the chemicals.
Okay, thank you. Another question on fertilizer. So someone is asking if you would use organic fertilizers such as pulverized eggshells or a banana peel tea.
Now, I've not heard of the banana peel tea. Must be something new that's come out in the last. You can use banana peel tea. I'm assuming that it's well composted and it's broken down into its components. But you have to know what minerals it's providing. So, you know, plants need NPK, you know, the three big macronutrients. And then there's some talk out there about micronutrients, but really when we're looking online and it's telling us that these plants need all these micronutrients and you need to buy this and you need to buy that and you need to buy this, understand in container vegetable gardening, things are a little bit different because we're using potting soil, and that potting soil is already got the nutrients. Now, when it comes to supplemental fertilization, your whatever it is you're using, and if you're making your own banana peel tea, do you know what macronutrients are in it? Because your plant's going to need nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus to grow well. It doesn't need a lot of it, but it's going to need some of it. So if you knew that your concoction provided those elements and didn't provide too much of those elements, then sure, well versed to use homemade components, as long as you're well aware of what they're providing. Because we do run into the problem with fertilization of containers, we can very easily over fertilize our containers, and that's why it's so important to pay attention to label instructions. And if we over fertilize those containers, we're going to burn the heck up out of our plant, and so we really have to be a bit more careful. So yes, you can use your own homemade things. Just know what it's providing to your plants and in what ratio it's providing it to your plants.
Okay, we did have a question on soil, but someone is asking if you could again recommend a kind, which we don't do as master gardeners. So just whatever you can get in a big box.
I will say one thing. It has been my experience that organic potting soils, well, it may seem, you know, if you're an organic gardener, of course you want to use an organic potting soil, but I have found organic potting soils, labeled organic potting soils, it has been my experience over the past years that they are less than favorable for growing good vegetables. And I think it's because they do have base materials in them that decay, and they decay faster. And sometimes when they're sitting around in those bags for months at a time at a store, the decay has progressed to holding some not good bacteria in them. So that would be my only caution when it comes to potting soil. Like Barb said, we can't recommend specific varieties. Just be careful of the organic potting soils. If they've been sitting around, they could actually hurt your plant versus help your plant.
Okay, so I am typing in the email address for our Master Gardener Help Desk if someone has any further questions that they didn't think about right now and might be thinking about as they're out there planting their containers after the frost.
Yes, cover them up.
After this weekend. So with no further questions, I want to say thank you again, Denise, for your 5 series of vegetable information to the Loudoun County.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining me. And as Barb probably already told you, please keep our website. Please look at our website weekly. Things may be added. Different programs may be added. I think that I'll probably be back again in early June, and we'll talk pests.
Sounds great. Thank you. Take care, everyone. Stay safe.
All right. Bye-bye.